Hello there, my name is Benedetta and welcome to Tender is a Read. Today's video is going to be all about ancient Greek mythology, literature, retellings, and essentially how to get into this genre from my point of view. If you've clicked on this video, chances are you're already aware of the fact that mythology retellings have become a massive genre in the past few years, and that has served as the introduction to a whole new side of literature for many people. Now, I've loved Greek mythology for as long as I can remember, and due to my education, I've been able to study Greek and Latin literature throughout school, and therefore I feel like I already have an affinity to this genre, and retellings have been such a source of entertainment and enjoyment for me. But whenever I post about it on my Instagram, I do get questions from people who want to start getting into the genre, and also people who have tried and have been disappointed. They just don't get the hype, and they ask me, why is that? Like, how can you enjoy this stuff so much when I read it and it felt really dull? I don't know that I definitely have the answer to that, but I do think that it comes down to how to approach the subject altogether. I do think that you sort of need a little bit of background, and in general also, if the other way around is true, if you have enjoyed retellings and if you want to know more about Greek mythology, I have put together a little guide to introduce you to the various steps of reading content that has to do with Greek and Roman mythology and literature. So I hope this is not too confusing, but I'm just going to give you a breakdown of how I personally have approached it and how I think it's most optimal to enjoy the subject the most. If you haven't already, don't forget to subscribe to this channel. If you are into mythology retelling, I am planning on posting more about that, and I already have a very long video breaking down all of the mythology retellings that I've read so far, even though that should be updated because I've read more since. It's, as I said, a very hot genre at the minute, so of course there's new coming out every day, which is super exciting for me, so you can find that linked over here if you want to go watch it later. But in the meantime, let's jump into the video. So my number one tip, the first place to start in my opinion, is mythology anthologies. Okay, so pick up a book that in general collects loads of stories from ancient mythology so that you can just have an overview of all of these little separate tales. These stories don't really elaborate too much, but they do something that is extremely important in the sense that, first of all, they write these stories in a language that is more modern, which makes it more accessible for us. And secondly, because there is such a plethora of ancient sources, because of the fact that these stories span centuries, but also because of the oral tradition and the fact that there are different ancient authors who have different interpretation of the same source material, it's really handy to get a book that just puts all of that neatly in a little package that you can just read as if it was a fairy tale book. Another reason why this is a great place to start is that we have lost so much material from the ancient world. Think about the fact that we have the Iliad and the Odyssey, so the two big Homeric poems. But if you think about the Iliad, it only picks up in the last year of the war and it ends before the most famous episode, arguably, which is that of the horse. How do we know about that? We have fragments of lost poems that belong to the same Trojan War cycle and that have simply not survive to our day. So if you want to learn about the entire story, Homer is not the place to go. Realistically, the handiest, as I said, place to go is one of these collections, which will put together everything neatly for you. Now, the one that I'm holding right now is Bullfinch's Mythology, which is an anthology written back in the 1800s, and it does contain a lot of the standard Greek and Roman mythology. It's very thorough. However, some critics have noted how it's a bit biased due to the fact that it was written in a time in which a lot of Christian values would be sort of overlaid on top of these stories, which is a bit weird. So I wouldn't advise you to pick up this one in particular as your first access, but I've talked about this book in other videos and why I think it's amazing besides the ancient sort of world mythology part. But anyway, so I'll set aside, but these are the ones that I actually would recommend if you're a beginner, even if you just want a book that is like handy to keep in your collection, so when, I don't know, you're reading a mythology retelling and you want to see how accurate a story is, you can always pick it up. So the most famous modern anthologies that I can think of is the Fleben Frei ones. So I only have two of them, Heroes and Troy. There is a first one which is called Mythos, and it breaks down all the myths related to the gods and the creation of the world and all the titans and other immortal beings. Heroes deals with a handful of Greek heroes. The most important, I think, you have Perseus, Heracles, Theseus, of course, but also Meleager, Atalanta, Bellerophon, and then Troy is the entire story of Troy, from the episodes that relate to Heracles and Poseidon and Apollo, and then later comes to the escape of Aeneas towards Italy, so what comes after the fall of Troy itself. The other two books that I've got here were written by John Sperling, and they're called Arcadian Nights and Arcadian Days. Both of these deal with heroes that are sort of related to this region of Greece. So in this one, for example, you have Agamemnon, Apollo, who is obviously a god, Heracles, Perseus, and Theseus, and then on this one you have Prometheus and Pandora, Jason and Medea, Oedipus and Antigone, Achilles and Thetis, Odysseus and Penelope. You really span a lot of different stories, very easy to read with some irony, with some commentary. But another book that I can recommend is Greek Myths by Charlotte Higgins. That one takes a different perspective because instead of going by the usual heroes who are all male, of course, it takes the perspective of the female characters. And once again, it gives us so many different stories. Some of them are lesser known than others. So you have a wide selection. You don't have to read all of them. You can probably read one or two depending how expansive they are, and then I think that you're good to go and you can move on to the second step. So mythology retellings, you've probably heard of this if you browse Bookstagram or Book Talk. These are proper novels, so they use the characters from Greek mythology, from Greek literature, and they build different narratives around them with obviously a modern sensitivity and a far more expansive narrative than what you find in the myths when retold in a way that is sort of more stagnant, like in an anthology. A lot of people my age probably grew up with the Percy Jackson and the Olympians series, which was such an amazing saga. For me, it was definitely the level of Harry Potter and Hunger Games. I'm just sad that, you know, those movies totally tanked, and I'm definitely looking forward to the new TV show, and hopefully it's going to be as grand as it deserves to be. But that is a great example of a mythology retelling aimed towards children and young adults, which takes mythology figures, so the gods, various monsters, and it sets them in the modern world where you have characters who are so more ordinary and they find out that they're demigods and then go on quests and adventures which pretty much mimic what heroes of Greek mythology did and what you find when you read their stories. Now, there are a lot of mythology retellings that do follow that same idea of taking the stories to the modern world. Personally, those are not books that I read anymore. I much prefer books that are sort of set in the ancient world itself. Personally, I have a particular affinity for the books that keep very close to the source material, but what they do is simply they reinterpret it, giving a voice to these characters, giving them dialogue, or sort of connecting the dots when, for example, you have characters who appear in different narratives as sort of like cameos, right? But by reshaping the story around them as the main character, you have such a different perspective, which is usually really enjoyable to read. There are also some mythology retellings that do more of a historical fiction type of job where they try to put the story into a, you know, real setting, as real as we can reconstruct it from the modern world, which is of course something that historians debate about. Nevertheless, it does still make for fascinating books. I personally, once again, prefer the ones that do feature the gods and then keep the mythology elements more, but the way they play with removing gods and giving more agency to men and women is absolutely fascinating. Personally, I feel like when you do have a background in Greek mythology, you can understand or sort of almost see where the story is going or how an author is bending the story a little bit better, and I think that that can enhance your reading experience. Now, of course, this this is a subjective opinion and I'm just giving you my advice based on what I use. But that said, these stories absolutely stand on their own. They're usually very well written and can be either romances or fantasy adventures, sort of contemporary or literary fiction, and they're just simply set in the past with characters that are not wholly original in the sense that you find them in Greek literature. Some of my favorite retellings include Circe and Song of Achilles by Madeline Miller, Atalanta and Ariadne by Jennifer Saint, Queens of Themyscira by Hannah Lynn, and so on and so forth. There really is a lot. Let me know if you want to see an entire video dedicated to my recommendations in this genre. As I said, I have a video breaking down my thoughts on all the ones that I've read, but if you want a specific one, maybe a shorter one with some recommendations, let me know. Now, you've been on this Greek mythology journey and you've decided that you want to take a dip into the original materials. But of course, these are ancient classics, they feel daunting, so where do you start? First off, I would say that most of the people who take their first venture into Greek literature go for the Homeric poems. The most famous titles out of this era, which are of course the Iliad and the Odyssey. These poems are absolutely amazing. I've read them just last year or the year before, and as you can see, they're heavily annotated. I had such a great time reading them on my own, although I did study them and also translated them in school. But I can tell you that the experience of actually reading it is not any less pleasurable than it is to perhaps study them with all the background that takes. These are definitely must-reads for a reason. First of all, they feature some of the most compelling heroes in Greek mythology. The Iliad is more of a choral composition, I would say. There are loads of heroes that interact with each other. On one side you have Agamemnon and Achilles, of course, Odysseus, Diomedes, Ajax, Menelaus, I mean, you can go on. And then on the other you have King Priam and Prince Hector, who remain as such iconic characters. The Odyssey, on the other hand, is just the adventure of Odysseus making his way back to Ithaca, and he encounters so many gods and monsters, and his adventures at face value I would say they sound more entertaining, but I have to say that the last time I read them I almost slightly prefer the Iliad. Either way, both of them show such complexity. These books really beg for reflection. They really teach something, say something about the value of war, of valor, and being a hero, what that means on several different levels. They're not easy reads, but I would highly recommend that you give them a shot if you're somebody who has an interest in the subject of mythology and ancient Greek world and literature in general. Now, I know that there are several videos that you can find on YouTube, for example, but also Instagram and Book Talk by creators such as Mo and Ink that I can link below, that sort of break down chapter by chapter everything that happens in these poems. Those can be very deep analysis if that's something that you think may help you, but there are also just more sort of surface level ones if you need an overview of, for example, all of the gods' roles and which alliances form amongst them in the poems. I mean, you can always help yourself when you're reading them through, you know, a plethora of material you can find online for sure. If you like the originals, you may want to check out the fan fiction. This is the Aeneid by Virgil, which is another epic poem written much later in Rome under the reign of Emperor Augustus. And Virgil basically took a Trojan prince called Aeneas who escapes from the fire that engulfs Troy in the end, and he sails towards Italy, where one day his descendants will found Rome and then eventually be the dynasty that will rule the empire. This is definitely a piece of propaganda and I just love the historical background. But other than that, the poem, in my opinion, does stand on its own 2 feet. I really enjoyed reading it quite recently as well. Bear in mind that the characters' names will be changed to fit the Roman nomenclature, but very enjoyable. And also don't forget to read these in the correct chronological sequence because, yeah, you don't want to get ahead of yourself. Now, besides epic poems, there are of course various different genres represented in Greek and Roman literature, and this is just like a very short little selection that I've made. But another piece of work that I would definitely recommend is Ovid's Metamorphoses. This is a collection of several different myths put together by Ovid, who is once again an author that was living under Augustus, and the central theme is change or transformation, which is obviously what metamorphosis means. As you can see from how thick it is, this is such a great collection of myths. They are also fun, and Ovid has such an interesting voice. He is very prone to rowdy type of stories, and his storytelling is definitely a bit extreme, but in a way that makes it super entertaining. I mean, for us, definitely our sensitivities can handle a bit of roughness, but from a writing point of view, it's extremely beautiful to read, in my opinion. I also really enjoy the framing device of how all of these different stories are clumped together in a way that makes logical sense. Because this collection puts together so many different myths, is oftentimes used as the source for retellings, for example, and it's one of the main sources that we have, together with Apollodorus, who wrote the Library of Greek Mythology, which is, you know, sort of the Greek version of this. For that reason, of course, bear in mind that Ovid's version of the myths is not the only one that exists. If you ever go online and get mad at somebody for talking about myth differently than what you read in Ovid, because of course he's a Roman, he writes a lot later than a lot of the Greek authors before the Hellenistic period, and also Romans had a very different sense of humor and of entertainment than the Greeks did. Nevertheless, I think that this was a hoot to read, and I would highly recommend it because the stories are all extremely fascinating and he spares no detail, which makes it super fun. And finally, the last genre of Greek mythology that I want to give a shout out to is the tragedies. Once again, you can find this in the Roman version as well, and in fact Seneca, who you may know is a philosopher, has written a few that I really want to read, but I've not had the chance yet in a long time, at least in school, so I don't feel like recommending them yet. So we have 3 surviving tragedians from ancient Athens that have survived to our day, and they are Aeschylus, Sophocles, and Euripides. Each of them have written loads of plays that were staged back in the day, and some of them again have survived, and you can find them in little handy books that collect several of them because of the fact that they are extremely short. So one of the things that I like the most is the fact that these usually fall under 50 pages, so not really time consuming, but it's a great time nonetheless. The tragedies usually take on well-known episodes of Greek mythology, and they build such a fascinating narrative. Considering that these are such ancient authors, you would be very surprised by how modern, how relevant some of the themes tackled feel, how gorgeous these monologues that many characters get, especially female characters. And in fact, it's obviously not a coincidence that these plays are still staged today. So if you've read a particular mythology retelling that you found fascinating, chances are that it was actually inspired by one of these tragedies. For example, stories that have to do with Clytemnestra and Agamemnon, but also with Electra, with Phaedra, or Medea, and several other characters who, of course, today are the center of these retellings because of the fact that thanks to these narratives, they have been given so much dimension that it's just a fun exercise, I guess, for modern authors to pick them back up and building around these fascinating personalities. So those were my basic tips, my journey into Greek mythology and literature 101. As somebody who has become passionate about this genre as a child, I am so happy that this genre is now viral and booming online. And I really want for everybody to enjoy it as much as me so that I have somebody to talk about it with. Let me know if you have any tips that have helped you get into this genre yourself. I would love to hear your comment, and also please don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel so that I know that you're enjoying this content. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you next time. Bye!